The first stone was a promise and a burden. Alara knelt in the frigid September water of the swift river, her fingers numb as they traced the smooth gray curve of it. It was the size of a loaf of bread, dense and heavy, worn featureless by 1,000 years of current. Boro, her lanky, brindle-coated dog, watched from the bank, his intelligent amber eyes tracking her every move, his head cocked with a familiar, patient curiosity. He whined softly, a low note of concern as the icy water wicked up the sleeves of her worn woolen shirt. She ignored it. She had to. She shifted her weight, getting a firm grip, and heaved. The stone broke the surface with a sucking gasp, shedding a sheet of crystalline water. It weighed 30 pounds, maybe 40. She cradled it against her chest, her back protesting as she straightened and waded through the shallows to the muddy bank. She set it carefully in the bed of the worn wooden handcart she had built herself. It was the first of many. Hundreds, she thought, perhaps thousands. Boro nudged her hand with his cold nose, a silent question. She just stroked his broad head, her gaze fixed on the small, skeletal frame of the cabin she was raising on the rise overlooking the river valley. Her father's land, her father's plan. Now, just hers. He and her mother were gone, taken by the fever that spring, leaving her with an unfinished cabin, a half-plowed field, and a set of leather-bound journals filled with his meticulous, eccentric handwriting. The cabin's frame was strange. He had designed it with 2 complete sets of walls, an inner and an outer, separated by an 18-inch cavity, a house with hollow bones. That's what Mr. Gable had called it when he'd stopped by a week ago, leaning on his fence post and chewing on a piece of straw. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen, Alara," he'd said, his voice a gravelly mix of pity and condescension. He was a man who had seen 60 winters in this valley and believed he understood all their secrets. "What are you planning to do with a gap that wide? Store ghosts? You'll never heat a place like that. The winter winds will settle in those walls and turn your home into a block of ice." Alara had simply looked at him, her hands resting on the raw pine of the frame. "I have a plan," she said. Her voice was quiet, unused to conversation. "A plan?" Gable had chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Your father was a good man, girl, but he had ideas. Strange ideas. This looks like one of them. You should fill that gap with moss and sawdust, like a sensible person. Seal it up tight. That's the only way to survive a winter here." She had not argued. Arguing was a waste of breath, and breath was a precious commodity when you spent your days hauling logs and lifting stones. She just nodded and turned back to her work. His words, however, settled in the air, joining the chorus of doubt that emanated from the small cluster of homesteads that made up the town of Hemlock's Ford. They saw a young woman, barely 20, orphaned and alone, building a folly on a hill. They saw a tragedy in the making. She made 6 more trips to the river that day, until the bed of the handcart was full and her muscles screamed in protest. Each journey was a slow, arduous procession. The pull up the incline was brutal, the wheels of the cart sinking into the soft earth. Burrow walked beside her, his body occasionally leaning against her leg as if to offer his own strength. By the time the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks to the west, she had a small pile of 34 smooth gray stones lying beside the cabin. It was a pathetic-looking mound against the scale of the empty walls. It was barely a start. Exhausted, she slumped down on the ground, her back against the pile, the residual cold of the river seeping through her clothes. Boro rested his head in her lap, sighing with a weary contentment that mirrored her own bone-deep fatigue. She looked at the stones, then at the house. 2,000 pounds. That was the number her father had written in his journal, underlined 3 times. 2,000 pounds of river stone, per wall, A thermal battery, he'd called it. That night, by the flickering light of a tallow candle in the old, drafty shack she was living in temporarily, she opened the journal again. The page was filled with his familiar script, a mix of elegant cursive and blocky, technical diagrams. The arrogance of conventional wisdom, he wrote. They build thin walls and stuff them with grass or paper, a pathetic shield against the killing cold. They fight the winter. They try to hold it at bay with bigger and bigger fires, burning through a woodpile in a week, only to feel the chill creep back in the moment the flames die down. They do not understand the nature of heat. It is not a thing to be trapped, but a thing to be held, to be stored. He had drawn a cross-section of the wall, outer log shell, inner log shell, and in between, a dense, carefully packed mass of river stone. The stones are a vessel, the entry continued. During the day, even in winter, the sun on the south-facing wall will warm them. A small, efficient fire inside will warm them further. They absorb this energy slowly, patiently. And then, through the long, dark, brutal night, they release it. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. A steady, constant, radiant warmth. The house does not fight the cold. It breathes with it. It holds the memory of the sun. Ilara traced the drawing with her finger. She could hear his voice in the words, the quiet passion that the rest of the town had mistaken for foolishness. He had been a scholar before he was a farmer, a man who read books on geology and physics for pleasure. He saw the world not as a set of rules to be obeyed, but as a system to be understood. She looked at her hands. They were red and raw, with the beginnings of blisters forming at the base of her fingers. 2,000 pounds per wall, 4 walls, 8,000 pounds of stone, 34 down, 7,966 to go. She closed the journal, blew out the candle, and curled up under a pile of blankets, Boro a warm, heavy weight at her feet. Sleep did not come easily. Mr. Gable's voice echoed in her mind. A block of ice. She pulled the blankets tighter, the chill of the shack a present reality, and thought of the slow, patient warmth of sun-soaked stone. The work had to be done before the first snows, and the first snows in this part of the country could come as early as October. She had less than a month. The days fell into a rhythm of brutal, repetitive labor. Dawn broke, painting the sky in pale shades of rose and gray, and she would already be on her way to the river, the empty cart rattling behind her. The morning hours were for gathering. She became an expert in stone, learning to spot the densest granite and gneiss, ignoring the lighter, more porous sandstone. She learned the subtle language of weight and balance, how to arrange the stones in the cart so they wouldn't shift and tip on the steep incline. The physical toll was immense. Her back became a landscape of dull, persistent aches. Her hands, once soft, became a cartographer's map of calluses, cuts, and scrapes. She tended to them each night, soaking them in warm salt water and applying a pungent salve her mother used to make. The afternoons were for building. This was a slower, more deliberate process. It was a puzzle in 3 dimensions. She couldn't just dump the stones into the wall cavity. That would leave air gaps, pathways for the cold to infiltrate. They had to be fitted together, nested and interlocked like the pieces of a dry stone fence. She would lift a stone, feel its shape and weight, and then find its perfect companion, turning it over and over until it settled into place with a satisfying, solid thud. Then she would fill the smaller gaps with sand and gravel, scooping it from the riverbank and hauling it up in buckets. It was agonizingly slow. Some days she would work for 6 hours and only see the level of stone in the walls rise by a few inches. The town watched. Mrs. Albright, a woman whose kindness was often suffocated by her anxiety, brought her a stew one afternoon. She stood with her hands on her hips, her brow furrowed with worry as she watched Ilara hoist a particularly large, awkward stone into place. "Child, you're going to break your back," she said, her voice sharp with concern. "This is no work for a young woman alone. And for what? A pile of rocks in your walls? It's not natural. A house should be light. It should breathe." "It will be warm," Ilara said, not looking at her, her focus entirely on settling the stone. She wedged a smaller rock beneath it to hold it steady. "Wait until winter," Mrs. Albright sighed, shaking her head as she set the stew pot on a nearby stump. "That's all I'll say. Just wait until the real winter comes. I pray you don't freeze in this experiment." Boro, who had been dozing in a patch of sun, lifted his head and let out a low growl. Ilara placed a hand on his back to quiet him. She appreciated the stew, but she did not need the doubt. It was a currency she was already drowning in. Not everyone was a skeptic. A young man named Liam, who worked the forge in town, sometimes walked the river path in the evenings. He was quiet like her, with thoughtful eyes and hands stained black with soot. The first time he saw her, he didn't mock or question. He just watched for a long time as she meticulously placed stones, her movements economical and precise despite her obvious exhaustion. "That's a lot of stone," he said finally, his voice calm and even. Ilara grunted in reply, levering a heavy slab into position with a pry bar. "What's the idea?" he asked, his curiosity genuine. She paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty forearm. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw none of the pity or derision she saw in the other townsfolk. She saw only interest. She decided to give him more than her usual two-word answer. "Thermal mass," she said. The words felt strange in her mouth, like quoting from a book. "The stones hold the heat from the fire. They release it slowly through the night." Liam nodded, his gaze moving from her to the partially filled walls. He ran a hand through his dark hair. "Like the stone hearth at the forge," he said, a spark of understanding in his eyes. "It stays warm for hours after the fire is out. You can't get near it." "Yes," she said, a small, involuntary smile touching her lips. "Like that." He didn't say anything else. He just nodded again and continued his walk. But he started stopping by every few days after that. Sometimes he'd bring her a freshly sharpened axe or a newly forged hinge for her door. He never offered to help with the stones. He seemed to understand that this was her work, her singular vision. But his quiet presence was a balm against the constant friction of the town's disapproval. His belief, unspoken as it was like a single warm stone in a river of ice. By mid-October, the walls were full. 8,000 pounds of smooth gray riverstone, packed tightly from the foundation to the roofline. The final act was to seal them, packing the top with a thick layer of insulating sod and clay. The house felt different now. When she stood inside, the silence was profound. The world outside seemed to fall away. The air within was still and held a strange, subterranean coolness, the scent of earth and stone and raw wood. The physical labor was not over. She still had to finish the roof, chink the thousands of gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and moss, build a hearth, and lay a floor. But the heart of the house was complete. She had hauled a piece of the riverbed up the hill and sealed it inside her home. She finished the last of the chinking on the day the first snowflakes fell. They were fat, wet flakes that melted as they touched the ground, but they were a warning. Winter was no longer a distant threat. It was at the door. She spent the next week gathering the last of her firewood, stacking it neatly against the north wall of the cabin, the wall that would take the brunt of the wind. She built a small, efficient Rumford-style fireplace and hearth, just as her father's journal had instructed, designed to throw maximum heat into the room with minimal draft. The day she lit the first fire, the air was sharp with the promise of a hard frost. Liam came by with a basket of late-season apples and stood with her in the single large room. The fire caught quickly, its flames dancing and casting flickering shadows on the smooth, planed wood of the inner walls. The air grew warmer, but it was a slow, gentle process. There was none of the immediate scorching heat you felt standing next to a pot-bellied stove. It was a pervasive, ambient warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Alara placed her hand on the inner wall, a foot away from the fireplace. It was still cool to the touch. "It's working," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "It's holding it," Liam said, his eyes on the fire. "It's drinking the heat." They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the flames and feeling the character of the room slowly change. The chill was gone, replaced by a steady, neutral comfort. When he left, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple, the kind of sunset that sailors and old farmers said was a harbinger of a storm. "Be safe, Alara," he said at the door, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. "I will be," she said. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it was true. The cold arrived 2 weeks later. It did not creep in. It fell like an executioner's axe. The temperature plummeted 30 degrees in a single night. A fierce, relentless wind howled down from the northern peaks, scouring the valley and piling snow into monstrous drifts. The world beyond her windows became a churning vortex of white. In town, people huddled around their stoves, feeding them a constant diet of seasoned oak and maple. They stuffed rags into the cracks around their doors and windows, fighting a losing battle against the insidious, probing fingers of the cold. Their thin-walled houses groaned under the assault, the wood shrinking and popping in the extreme temperatures. Inside Alara's cabin, it was quiet. The wind shrieked outside, a distant, frustrated beast, but within the stone-lined walls, the air was still. She kept a small, steady fire in the hearth, no bigger than was needed to cook her meals. It was all the house required. The stones, having absorbed warmth for 2 weeks, had become a massive, silent radiator. The inner walls were now warm to the touch, a gentle, consistent heat that permeated the entire space. There were no cold spots, no drafts. Boro, who in previous winters in the old shack had spent his time shivering under a pile of blankets, was stretched out languidly on the floorboards, his belly exposed and his paws twitching in a contented dream. She moved through her days in a state of calm. She baked bread, the scent filling the warm air. She mended her clothes. She read her father's journals, not for instruction anymore, but for companionship. She would press her palm against the wall and feel the steady, living warmth radiating back at her. It felt like a conversation. "You see?" the house seemed to say. He was right. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, when the temperature outside had dropped to 20 below zero and the wind was sharp enough to cut exposed skin, she heard a frantic pounding on her door. Boro shot to his feet, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. Alara quieted him with a hand and opened the door a crack. A blast of Arctic air and stinging snow swirled in. It was Mrs. Albright, her face pale and pinched, her shawl caked with ice. "Alara, thank God!" she cried, her voice thin and desperate. "My stovepipe, the wind took it. The house, it's as cold as a tomb. We can't get the fire lit again. My little Sarah is shivering so hard her teeth are chattering." Alara didn't hesitate. She opened the door wide. "Come in," she said. Mrs. Albright stumbled inside, her young daughter clutched in her arms. The moment they crossed the threshold, the woman stopped, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked around the cabin, at the small, placid fire, at the lack of any visible frost on the walls, at Burro lying calmly by the hearth. She touched her chapped cheek. "But how?" she stammered. It's warm in here, truly warm." She unwrapped her daughter, whose lips were tinged with blue, and rushed her toward the fire. "The stones," Ilara said simply. Before an hour had passed, there was another knock. It was the Millers, a family of 4 whose woodpile had been buried under a 10-foot drift. They arrived half frozen, their faces a mask of misery. They too stopped in stunned silence just inside the door, gaping at the impossible comfort of the small cabin. By nightfall, her home was a sanctuary. 12 people were sheltered within its walls. They sat huddled together, a small, humbled community of former skeptics. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes constantly drifting to the solid log walls. They couldn't see the stones, but they could feel them. They could feel the steady, unwavering warmth that was keeping them alive. The last to arrive was Mr. Gable. He came alone, his proud shoulders slumped in defeat, his beard encrusted with ice. He didn't knock. He simply fell against the door, and Ilara opened it to find him there, exhausted and chagrined. His own well-built, sensible house had finally betrayed him. A beam in his roof had cracked under the weight of the snow, and the wind was now gutting his home of all its warmth. He shuffled inside, avoiding her eyes, and sank onto a crate near the door, his body trembling with cold and something that looked like shame. He looked around at his neighbors, their faces weary but safe, and then at Ilara, who was quietly ladling hot broth into bowls. "The stones," he murmured, his voice raspy. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, an admission, a surrender. Ilara handed him a bowl of broth. Their eyes met. "Yes," she said, "the stones." For 3 more days the blizzard raged. Inside the stone house, a strange and quiet society formed. They shared stories, conserved food, and tended to one another. Ilara, the strange, stubborn girl who they had pitied and mocked, became their silent, unassuming leader. She moved with a quiet efficiency, ensuring everyone was fed and comfortable. She never once said, "I told you so." She didn't have to. The house said it for her, in its steady, unwavering language of warmth. When the storm finally broke and the sun emerged to glitter on a transformed, silent, white world, the people left her cabin one by one, their faces etched with a gratitude and awe that went far deeper than words. They had entered her home as skeptics, seeking only shelter. They left as converts, carrying with them a lesson learned not in their minds, but in their very bones. The valley would never look at Ilara or her strange stone house the same way again. The aftermath of the Great Cold of '88, as it came to be known, was a time of reckoning for Hemlock's Ford. The storm had exposed the fragility of their existence, the thinness of the walls they had placed between themselves and the brutal realities of winter. When the snows finally melted in a great, gushing spring thaw, the damage was laid bare. 2 families lost their homes entirely, their roofs collapsed. Nearly everyone had suffered some form of damage, from cracked foundations to warped timbers. The only structure left completely unscathed, serene and solid on its hill, was Ilara's. The change in the town's attitude was palpable. The whispers and sideways glances were replaced with nods of profound respect. People who had once crossed the street to avoid her now sought her out, their questions humbled and sincere. Mr. Gable was the first to make a formal pilgrimage. He appeared at her door one sunny April morning, hat in hand, his face weathered and serious. Burro, lying on the porch, thumped his tail once but didn't rise. "Ilara," he began, his gravelly voice stripped of its old condescension. "I've come to apologize. I was a fool, an old, stubborn fool who thought he knew everything. He paused, looking at the solid walls of her house as if seeing them for the first time. My whole life I've been fighting the winter. You made friends with it. Ilara simply nodded, waiting. I need to rebuild before the next snows, he continued. My house is ruined. I was hoping you might teach me about the stones. It's not my knowledge, she said quietly, her first multi-sentence response to him. It was my father's. She went inside and returned with one of the leather-bound journals, holding it out to him. It's all in here. Gable took the book with a reverence usually reserved for a Bible. He opened it, his rough fingers tracing the elegant script and precise diagrams. A thermal battery, he read aloud, his voice filled with wonder. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with a convert's zeal. It'll work, he said, echoing her own words back at her from months before. He was the first, but not the last. That summer, the valley was filled with a new sound, one that blended with the buzzing of insects and the rustling of leaves, the rhythmic clatter of river stones being loaded into handcarts. Ilara's hill became a school. She never lectured. She simply worked on her own small barn, using the same method, and let them watch. She showed them how to choose the right stones, how to fit them without leaving gaps, how to mix the sand and gravel to fill the voids. Liam, his forge now busy making pry bars and heavy-duty hinges for the new construction, became her unofficial partner. He was better with people, and he would translate her quiet demonstrations into practical advice for the others. The community, fractured by hardship, was reforged in shared labor. Men and women who had struggled alone in their own homes now worked together, hauling stones for a neighbor's wall, helping to raise the heavy log frames. Mrs. Albright, her daughter now healthy and rosy-cheeked, organized communal meals for the work crews. The rebuilding of Hemlock's Ford became a testament not just to a new way of building, but to a new way of being. They were no longer a collection of isolated homesteads, but a community bound by the shared knowledge of the stones. By the time the first snows of the next winter fell, 5 new houses stood in the valley, their walls filled with the patient gray heart of the river. They called them stoneholds, and they were warm and safe. Ilara's folly had become the standard. Her quiet persistence had not just saved a dozen people during a storm, it had fundamentally changed the future of the entire valley. Her relationship with Liam deepened through the long summer of work. Their bond was not one of grand pronouncements, but of shared glances across a rising wall, of passing a tool without a word, of sitting together on her porch in the evenings, watching the stars come out, the silence between them as comfortable and solid as the house itself. Years passed. The winter of the Great Cold became a legend, a story told to wide-eyed children around warm hearths and houses that no longer feared the wind. Ilara's walls, as they came to be known outside the valley, became a regional curiosity, then a model. People would travel from 2 counties over to see the house on the hill and to learn the principles of thermal mass. Ilara, now married to Liam, her hair showing the first threads of silver, would greet them with her same quiet composure, offering them a seat by her fire and a chance to feel the steady, radiant warmth of the walls for themselves. She never took credit. "It was my father's idea," she would always say. "The river did the work." Boro grew old. His brindle muzzle turned gray, his amber eyes clouded with age. He moved more slowly, his powerful legs stiff in the mornings. He spent most of his days sleeping in his favorite spot by the fire, his dreams filled with the phantom scent of river mud and the echo of stones clattering in a wooden cart. One autumn evening, with the leaves outside turning brilliant shades of red and gold, he rested his great head on Alara's lap and gave a deep, contented sigh. His breathing grew shallow, and then, peacefully, it stopped. Alara sat with him for a long time, her hand resting on his still flank, the warmth slowly leaving his body. The grief was a quiet, heavy stone in her own chest. Liam helped her bury him the next morning beneath the tall pine tree where he had so often watched her work. They placed a single, perfect river stone on the small mound of earth. There were no words, only a shared, profound silence. The house felt emptier without its first and most faithful believer. Decades flowed by like the river below. The valley prospered. The stonehold stood, solid and enduring, passed down from one generation to the next. Alara and Liam raised 2 children in the house on the hill, who grew up and had children of their own. Alara became the valley's matriarch, a figure of quiet legend. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, were no longer capable of lifting stones, but her eyes were as clear and observant as ever. She would sit on her porch, watching her grandchildren play, and feel the deep, resonant satisfaction of a life well lived. She had not set out to change the world, only to survive it. But in securing her own safety, she had ensured the future of her community. One crisp winter afternoon, when she was 87 years old, Alara sat in her rocking chair by the hearth. The fire was burning low, a gentle pulse of orange and red. Liam had passed 5 years before, and she missed him with a dull, constant ache. The house was quiet. Outside, a light snow was falling, dusting the world in a fresh coat of white. She placed her wrinkled hand on the wall beside her chair. It was warm. It was always warm. It held the memory of every fire she had ever built, every ray of sunshine that had ever fallen upon it. It held the memory of her father's brilliance, of her own stubborn youth, of Liam's quiet belief, of Boro's steadfast companionship. It was a vessel, not just of heat, but of a life. She closed her eyes, her breathing slowing to match the gentle rhythm of the fire. The warmth of the stones seemed to seep into her, loosening the tired knots in her old muscles. She thought of that first stone, cold and heavy in the river. She thought of the 8,000 that followed, a promise and a burden, a promise she had kept. She smiled, a faint, peaceful expression on her face. The rocking chair stilled. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the quiet house on the hill. The house stood for another century, a landmark and a monument. Generations of Alara's family lived within its warm, silent walls. Travelers passing through the valley would always ask to see it. The original Stonehold, the house that taught a whole region how to live with winter. Eventually, it was given to the township, preserved as a museum, a testament to the quiet, stubborn woman who had listened to the wisdom of stone. Beside the house, near a tall, ancient pine, were 3 simple grave markers, one for a man, one for a woman, and a smaller, flat one for a dog. Alara's stone was worn smooth by time and weather, but the inscription was still legible, carved deep and sure. It did not speak of her deeds or her fame. It said only, Alara. She built a warm home.